Well, welcome everyone to the second day. I've been checking out some sessions and we'll continue to check out more. This session is Who We Don't Talk About in the Old West. So if that's where you were intending to be, congratulations. My name, I hope to not talk too much. I'll just lightly moderate. My name is Svein Newman. I live here in Missoula, and I've kind of been coming to the book festival off and on for some years, and so was just sort of asked to help host a couple of sessions. But this session is really about the authors, and today we're lucky to be joined by three of them. Craig Lancaster of Billings will do a reading, kind of he's the opening act of the next hour, and then we'll spend a little more time with Michael K. Johnson and Christy Lescavar, who'll do presentations and sort of combined reading presentations maybe. Then we'll open it up for some discussion and Q&A. It's a small enough group. I think we can be pretty informal. But we only have an hour, so with that in mind, let's kick it off. I was not given a written bio for Craig, but as a longtime former Billings resident, I can say that he's one of the literary jewels of the Magic City, current sports editor, longtime journalist, and is about to publish his 11th book. Very funny guy in the real world. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to this reading. It's from a not yet published book, so I think we're very lucky to have a little sneak peek. So, Craig.
Welcome to this nonfiction panel. Here comes 15 minutes of fiction. This is, I'm going to do a reading from my novel that's coming out next year, next May. It's called Dreaming Northward. And I will give you a very short overview because, like I said, I've got 15 minutes and I timed myself on the reading and I can get there if I'm fast. So it is a family story that spans 4 timelines, 1952, 1972, 2002, 2012. So I'm going to read the first 2002 chapter. And this character sort of is the hinge of the whole thing. So anyway, I will jet off. I should say you're the first audience to hear a live reading from this book, other than my dog. My dog is more into nonfiction, history of kibble, so he didn't really like it, but I hope you do. Okay, it's July 2002, Billings, Montana. They're in the thick of the city, Cherie and her mom, and it's coming together. What Cherie recognizes, what's changed, the fuzziness of memory about how long it's been, a while for sure. When did we last come out this way, together? Cherie asks, face still tilted toward the passenger side glass and the warehouses of the industrial district sliding past. Anna clears her throat but doesn't say anything. Cherie spins herself a quarter turn, granting attention. Mom? I'm trying to think, Anna says now. I guess if I have to think about it, it's been too long, huh? I guess. Cherie considers her hands clenched in her lap and squeezing blood from the knuckles. She relaxes the grip. She makes a hitch in her seating position toward Anna. Her mother has gotten old and fast. Old to begin with in their journey together, at least by society's convention. A 31-year-old first-time mother, only-time mother as it'll turn out, unless she's got a whale of a surprise lurking out there in the future. She's 49 now, and Cherie is cognizant of how every annum has etched itself into the weary face and the bony hands and the loosening skin of her arms and the hair that's thinning out, not noticeable in the day-to-day, but certainly so in the longer view she's been afforded. Anna snaps her fingers. 2 years ago, come Thanksgiving, she says. That's when it was, I'm pretty sure. No, that long? Yep. Cherie sure enough remembers that. Her grandma wasn't like the stereotype, certainly wasn't the kindly, matronly, pillowy, soft grandma some of her friends have. So it had been a surprise that year when she had called them and said, I don't feel like making the drive this year. You come to me, how about? Opal Knutson's taking a pass on drinking downtown at night and skiing the Lick Creek Loop by day should have been all the signal they needed that something wasn't quite right. But they'd simply loaded up and driven into Billings from Bozeman, a couple of hours, shared the only other bedroom in Opal's house, and made their way through a Thanksgiving dinner, Such as it was, 3 hungry man trays nuked into dryness. Then they watched Randy Moss and the Vikings burn the Cowboys on Opal's snowy TV screen. All around, something short of satisfying. We should have come more often, Cherie says, and in the next moment she regrets the words because she knows her mother will calcify them in her heart. But, life and stuff. Life and stuff, Anna repeats. It gets in the way. Cherie grins, big and encouraging, and she juts it out there until her mother makes eye contact and ponies up her own grimmer smile. Surely Anna has regrets. Piling those up comes with the act of living, which Cherie knows to be true enough even from the vantage point of her mere 18 years. Just as Anna wanted to pull away from Opal, wanted to find the distance that gave her both sovereignty and some easy means of getting back to her mother in a time of need, so does Cherie want to cut loose and fling herself toward the horizons. She could have had Annapolis and all that follows, clear paths to wherever she imagined she might want to go. Instead, she'll be taking day classes at Montana State, at home in Bozeman. It's just the two of them now, has been for a long time, and with Opal gone, this is no time to be bailing, she has decided. We should have, Anna said. I know, Cherie says. It just went by quick, and endings have a tendency toward the sudden and the unexpected. Opal waking up on a fine June day, doggedly and insistently independent, even after the stroke in the winter of 2001. Opal pitching over in the hydrangea soon after, found there by a neighbor in the falling dusk. Here, gone. The same effect holds in the smaller life cycles. One day you're a sophomore and you can't imagine a bigger thrill than receiving the attentions of Brett Tomaszek. The next, after seemingly a rushed in-between time, you're wearing a mortarboard and being handed a diploma, and Brett Tomaszek and every other boy, you know what they want and you will not give it up, can go pound sand. You have things to do. Anna cuts left at the fairgrounds and the car heads up the rise into the Billings Heights, disconnected from and almost a distant cousin of the city in the bowl, the one hemmed in by rim rocks to the north and the Yellowstone River to the south. Traffic grows thicker, like a stew left on the range. Cherie recognizes the contours, but is baffled by the particulars and the transients of strip malls, of chain fast food, of nail salons and dog groomers. She settles back. It'll be just a bit yet before it all thins out and they come to the turnoff toward Opal's place. How you feeling, Anna asks. Antsy? Me too. A little sad. Anna murmurs something indistinct and then, me too. Cherie fidgets. The larger truth of the matter is that she didn't want to come, but also didn't see any way to pass on it. Life's obligations, she is finding out, don't fit into just one box. There are those you take onto yourself, like a mortgage or, more particular to her, a student loan. There are those thrust upon you, homework and job duties and the like, or the way her mother rallied out here for a week after Opal's stroke. And then there are those that are handed out the moment you draw breath and are fully revealed to you over time. Here's your family. You don't know them. You might not even come to like them, but they're yours just the same, and now you're a carrier of the story they've given you. You can expand it, write the next turns in a different color of ink, turn slapstick into sorrow or prosperity into horror, but you have a responsibility to the underpinnings. So here you are, and here comes Opal's little white house on a little piece of land that was something grander until she sold it off chunk by chunk as she bowed to age and the need of money. Her land once grew sugar beets and alfalfa. Now it sprouts subdivisions. And here comes that prickle on the skin, that feeling beyond all rationality that Opal is still there somehow, that the atoms have scattered but the spirit persists. And Cherie is going to have to go in there and do what needs to be done to close this thing out and to hold her splintering mother together. And that all seems so much more possible when it was just a concept and not an in-your-face reality. Anna parks the car and sets the brake, and she goes to pieces. Cherie loosens her seatbelt and leans in across the console, arms around the older woman, head on her shoulder, words and warm breath on her ear. It's okay, Mom. Really, it's okay. Inside, it's a gut shot of just how much has to be done yet. How can one woman have so much? Cherie stretches her arms and oscillates her head, taking it all in again, the sheer magnitude of a lifetime's piling up. So much shit. Let's call it what it is. Anna across the room clucks her tongue at the profanity even as she's equally awed by the size of the chore before them. Cherie can see it in her mother's face. They knew, but they didn't know, and now here's the realization. Don't say shit, Anna says. Say opportunity. Opportunity for what? Eventual back surgery? Honey. Cherie walks the circumference, shaking her head. It really is remarkable how the tonnage didn't register when Opal was a living, breathing creature, responsible for it all and free to choose whether to have it or not. You're not thinking of yourself in a time like that, not imagining a day when she won't be here and what's hers will now be yours and the onus for dealing with it will be on you alone. Cherie thinks now that if she had been able to project this out, she might have said, "Hey, Grandma, when did you become such a pack rat?" and maybe tease her into some sort of action. She can also well imagine the rejoinder that would have been volleyed back. And anyway, Anna says, it's not one person. It's her. It's me. It's my grandparents before us. It's you too. I'll bet you find some of your dolls in picture books somewhere. Hooray, Cherie says, an archaeological dig. Oh, stop. Seriously, have you been down to the basement? Photo albums piled to the ceiling? Boxes, more boxes after those? So many boxes. I want those albums, Anna says. Sure. And the dishes. Why? Because I do. Okay, Cherie says. They've talked about this, what they'll salvage and what they'll scrap. And there's one thing only that Cherie wants, a 1930s Thorns powder puff music box given to Opal by her own mother after a trip to New York. A little painting of 3 women on the canister top. It plays, "I Kiss Your Hand, Madam," and "Button Up Your Overcoat." And the plinking notes and the heartier ones Opal was given to idly humming run through Cherie's memories. First thing she did upon arrival was flit inside, take it from the mantelpiece, and carry it back to the car. But Anna wants more, understandable because there's more of her here, and that's fine. But they had not discussed the dishes. They're nothing special. There had been no wedding, and thus there was no fine china pattern. And Cherie fears that her mother's grief will move ever more items from the junket pile to the take-it group, and she'll be faced with this same problem again down the road when another generation falls away and its tidal wave of crap lands on someone else, on her. Anna is gone again inside the pain, and she slumps into Opal's TV-watching chair and covers her eyes and tries to smother the heaves, but there's nothing to shroud what's happening to her. It's been like this since they got the word, unpredictable spasms of grief, not so much that they've rendered Anna non-functional, but also unrelenting when they come on. When Cherie yields to her own crying, it's not so much for Opal, whom she surely misses, but also just as surely knew would be leaving eventually and who squeezed more than the actuarial projection from this life. No, she cries for her own mother and the burden she carries that can't be relieved. Cherie kneels to her mom and says, "Come on now." Anna gamely wipes her face clear and smiles and says, "I know." Anna stands. "Let's start tomorrow. I saw a restaurant up on Main Street. Looked good. Let's eat, then let's start fresh on this stuff in the morning." "No," Anna says. "I'd like to get started now." "One load," Cherie says. "One trailer load so we can start in the morning with a dump run. Then dinner. Compromise?" Compromise. Cherie stretches a hand to her mother, who takes it and comes up from the chair. "I'll start in here," Anna says, waving a hand across the overstuffed living room. "Good enough. I'll start sorting out the back." Cherie leaves her there and cuts through the hallway to the 2 bedrooms that parallel each other. On the wall are black and white still lifes Opal took as a younger woman and a portrait that catches Cherie's attention, a sour-faced old woman she's looked at many, many times before, but now with the dying light shadows crossing the woman's jowls, she sees deeper into the visage. Hannah Knutson, Opal's mother, foretold her daughter's old lady features back in the 1940s as her time was drawing nigh, and she also zooms forward a half century and has something to say about how time is sanding away at Anna. It frightens Cherie. Is this what I have to look forward to? She touches the frame, tilts it upward to get it on the level. She then moves a finger across Hannah's face and darkens the light. By the time the photograph was taken, there had been loss, a lot of it, principally Alvin, Hannah's husband and Opal's father, and Hannah's biggest loss, her own passing, was edging into view. This was a woman who'd earned her right to be grim as she sat for a portrait. This was also a woman who saw and presumably heard a delicate, lovely music box while visiting a great American city and brought it home, in essence, to a girl who would be born in 1984, far beyond Hannah's own reach. That's something, isn't it? Smile, great grandma, Cherie whispers. It's not all bad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. And I don't know about y'all, but I feel really lucky to be at the first public reading of that. So that's great. We'll now sort of transition to the second part of the session. And Michael and Christy, I've been asked to transition y'all up here. So sorry to make you move. But Michael can stay standing because he's up first. By way of brief introduction, Michael K. Johnson teaches at the University of Maine at Farmington and is a former co-president of the Western Literature Association. His biography of Montana-born African-American singer Taylor Gordon, entitled Can't Stand Still, Taylor Gordon and the Harlem Renaissance, was published in 2019. His biography of Taylor's sister Rose, A Black Woman's West, The Life of Rose B. Gordon, was published in 2022 by the Montana Historical Society Press. Michael?
So it is the Black Woman's West that I'll be talking about today. Does need to turn this on? Or is it? Oh, tip it. Test. Okay, there we go. So I will be talking about the Black Woman's West today. And what I have are sort of an overview of Rose Gordon's history and the history of the Gordon family. And then I'm going to read a short section that comes directly from the book. So Rose was born in the Barker Mining District of Central Montana Territory. She was the daughter of John Francis Gordon, who was an African-American chef, and Mary Anna Goodall Gordon, who was an emancipated slave. They migrated to Montana Territory in the early 1880s, and eventually they settled in White Sulphur Springs, where Rose lived most of her life. She operated a restaurant in White Sulphur Springs for decades, as well as earning a living later in life as a massage therapist and as a caregiver. Her father died in 1893 in a train accident, at which point her mother had to sort of take over supporting the family. And she did so in part through taking in laundry and doing odd jobs, but she also began doing parties, right? She would help women who were having parties at their homes, and she would go to their homes and help them do these dinners. And that ended up sort of transitioning to her doing catering as a sort of profession around the city. And ultimately, she opened a restaurant on Main Street in White Sulphur Springs called the Gordon's Confectionery and Restaurant, right? Sometime around 1908, 1909 is when that started. And there was a Gordon restaurant in White Sulphur Springs from that point until after the Second World War. Rose started operating the restaurant in 1925 after her mother died as sort of a solo project, and did that almost 20 years. I guess wartime rationing made it difficult to profit in the restaurant business. And at that point, Rose was like, okay, I'm going to stop this. And then she did this kind of remarkable thing, is that she went in a completely different direction with her life and did a course in Swedish massage and became a massage therapist and a physiotherapist. Worked out of the Mountain View Hospital for part of that in White Sulphur Springs, working with the doctors there and doing massage therapy for their patients. But at the same time that she was doing this, she also began writing letters and columns for the White Sulphur Springs newspaper, and she did this for 20-some years. And a large part of my book is about Rose Gordon as a writer. And I make the claim that in these hundreds of items that she published in the newspapers, that she is a significant contribution as an African-American writer, as a Montana writer, and as a Western writer. So I, over a period of years, sat in the basement of Mantor Library at the University of Maine at Farmington, and I looked at microfilm rolls of over 100 years of White Sulphur Springs newspapers trying to locate the pieces that Rose had written. And what I wanted to do in the book was to actually make some of that material accessible, so that if you want to read Rose's writing, you don't have to sit in the basement of a library and scroll through hundreds of years of microfilms. So I quote a lot of material from her in the book. There's also an appendix that has a selection of her writing that makes that writing really published and accessible for the first time. So just for a little bit of context, so when the Gordons came to migrated to Montana, there was part of a sort of a group of African Americans moving to Montana after emancipation and after the Civil War. So in 1880, the U.S. Census registers 346 African Americans living in Montana. By 1890, that number had more than tripled and continued to increase over the next decade. White Sulphur Springs reflects that pattern. So a fire destroyed the records of the 1890 census, so we don't know the exact numbers for White Sulphur Springs in that year. But looking at the newspapers of the period, it's possible that African American citizens numbered more than the 30 that are registered in 1900 and 1910, which were according to the census, are the high points of African American population in White Sulphur Springs. There were a lot of people that appear in the newspaper that don't appear on the census records anywhere. So when the Gordons moved to White Sulphur Springs, there was actually a black community there that they were part of, right? That may have helped make life in White Sulphur Springs much more amenable for them and help them get through those early years. So Rose wrote in a manuscript that she says, "Never once when I was a child was I treated as if I were any color except white," right? Was her comment about growing up in White Sulphur Springs, in a town that was mostly white. By 1950, the only two African Americans in White Sulphur Springs were Robert Gordon and Rose, right, her brother and sister there. So when you see her make that statement, I think it makes us wonder, right? I think it's somewhat accurate, right? If it doesn't tell the whole story. Certainly the Gordon family found acceptance and stability in the community of White Sulphur Springs. And I also think that Rose is cautious in her criticism of her community. And I will point out later, her unpublished writing suggests a much more complicated experience of race and racial relations in White Sulphur Springs than what she has in her published material. All right. I want to pay tribute to Rose B. Gordon as a writer. Over the years that I worked on this project, I visited White Sulphur Springs several times. While there, I always make my way to the main cemetery to pay my respects to the Gordon family, and in particular to Rose and Taylor, whose graves are side by side. On each of these visits, I've seen flowers or the remnants of recently placed flowers on Rose's gravesite. 50 years after her death, someone remembers Rose B. Gordon and continues to pay tribute to her memory. Rose similarly paid tribute in writing to members of her community who passed away during her lifetime. So Rose contributed letters and other items to the White Sulphur newspapers throughout her life, but became a particularly frequent contributor in the 1940s. Rose's writings about her mother, about the grand old timers and treasured old places of White Sulphur Springs in its pioneer heyday, as well as about her life and the lives of others, make her a literary figure worthy of consideration. Rose's tributes were a genre that were well suited to her strengths as a writer, as they combined her interest in local history with her talent for personal narrative. And that's what the bulk of her contribution to the newspapers were these tributes that she wrote to recently deceased members of the community. Most of the tributes involve an overview of the individual's contribution to the community, as well as Rose's personal memories of the deceased. A typical example is her memorial to Lavinia Bandel, published in February 15th, 1950. And this is a long quotation from that tribute. "I want to pay tribute to Miss Lavinia Bandel. I well remember the first time I met her. She was a charming young lady, full of life and very pleasant. She possessed stability and inner poise. Everything she did was done well. She often spoke of her childhood days, saying she was taught to be obedient and above all to finish every duty she took part in. She married Mr. Eugene Bandel many years ago. She was a wonderful wife and a real helpmate. I will miss her very much. She was a kind neighbor. When I was planting my front yard, she gave me lilac bushes, golden glow, and many other plants. They will be living memories of her. She was a great lover of nature." Rose's memorials almost always begin with some variation of the phrase, "I want to pay tribute to." Although each piece in some ways resembles an obituary, key moments in the individual's public life form a much smaller part of the tribute. Instead, they often serve to emphasize character traits that Rose particularly admired. She often drew attention to the person's service to others, whether to family members or to the entire community, highlighting little kindnesses that could be easily forgotten. Most of all, Rose celebrated the homely and the everyday through personal anecdotes that reveal the personality of the deceased, such as that she was a great lover of nature who also shared the natural beauty that she loved with her neighbors. Rose frequently expressed how the life of the particular individual cleared a path for others to follow. What stands out about Rose's life is her consistent and heartfelt concern for the well-beings of others and her commitment to caring for them. That concern and care bridge various elements of her life and is evident in her role as a central figure in her family who was responsible for caring for her mother and for her brothers. She was also colloquially known in the White Sulphur Springs as the village babysitter. She often took care of children, and she continued to do this apparently throughout her life, right? Someone who was at a talk that I gave yesterday from White Sulphur Springs remembered they were children in the 60s, and they remember going over to Rose's house, and her brother Taylor was living there at the time, and Rose made like a big tub of popcorn, right? And so they sat and ate popcorn, and Taylor told them stories of the Wild West. Her memorial tributes reflect Rose's devotion to the people in her life. Marcella Scherfy, in describing how Rose blossomed in the final decades of her life, states that Rose became the community's historian and heart. In her tributes, Rose discovered the perfect conduit for joining history and heart together in a unique way. In doing so, she invented her own genre, the memorial tribute, a form that was uniquely capable of joining history and heart. The popularity of Rose's tribute also opened the door for her to comment on political and social issues in the newspaper. After establishing her voice as memorialist and historian, she expanded the subject matter that she covered in her letters and columns. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Rose commented on racial issues more frequently than she did in her earlier writing. She also at one point ran for the mayor of White Sulphur Springs. She didn't win, though. So in contrast to her published work, which took a more subtle approach, Rose's personal letters and other unpublished writings address candidly the prejudice that vexed her periodically through the 20th century. These unpublished writings demonstrate a fiery side to Rose's personality that rarely appeared in her public writing. And so this is an undated letter that was written to a Mrs. Ashford. And in this letter, Rose writes, "I just heard the latest gossip that Mrs. Winters is being asked to resign from her lodge for keeping my company. Mrs. Ashford, can you prove that my company is such that one would be damaged by my association? I know my skin is black, which I can't help. You might have been born black. Would that necessarily have to corrupt your character? Mrs. Ashford, I pity you as a mother would pity a child. And each night as you pray, ask God to teach you to understand that each race is his own and that you are not to abuse and wound their feelings." Mrs. Winters came into my life in one of the greatest sorrows that comes to a human being who loves home, the loss of my mother. And if being kind to the sad and suffering is against the rules of your order, may God send an angel to teach them the right way. I am sorry for Mrs. Winters. Her pleasures are limited, but you know some envious of them. I'm sorry. Her pleasures are limited, but you know some even envious of them. May God help you and bless you. Although clearly offended, Rose although clearly offended herself, Rose emphasized the offense done to Mrs. Winters. Even as big-hearted as Rose was, she was clearly willing to take to task those who deserve such a reprimand. Though angry, she still expressed Christian charity and concern. At the same time, telling someone they need this much help from God can hardly be considered complimentary. In the closing salutation, "May God help and bless you," there's a slip of the pen as Rose left out the word God, closing, "May help you and bless you." That elision may suggest the frustration and anger Rose felt, as if she could not bring herself to close the letter with a conventional statement of good wishes that might suggest a forgiveness that she was not quite ready to extend. In this letter, we see a private anger that makes clear just how carefully Rose crafted her public persona.
Thank you, Michael. Next up, we have Christy Lescavar. Christy was born in Butte, grew up in Kennewick, Washington, and earned degrees in mechanical engineering and French at the same time from Seattle University. She worked as an engineer for Bechtel until that fateful day when she visited her aunt in Whitehall and learned about the fire on the ranch near Forsyth, the dead body, and the orphanage in Twin Bridges. She's written 3 narrative nonfiction novels, each containing quite a bit of Montana history, the latest of which is East of the East Side. Christy.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. And just to clarify, I have written 3 books, One Night in a Bad Inn, Finding the Bad Inn, and East of the East Side, and they are all narrative nonfiction. So they read like a novel, but they're all true stories. So I am going to begin with reading just a little bit from the newest book, which is the subject for today, East of the East Side. Before engineers harnessed the mighty Missouri for electricity, and before use of natural gas was omnipresent, people burned coal and wood in their stoves. Industry burned coal to run machinery. Smelters burned coal to heat the furnaces. The mines burned coal to create steam to drive the hoists that lowered the miners into the mines and brought them back up again. Measures to clean the resulting soot and smoke were primitive or non-existent. The prevailing wind in Montana is from the west. The wind blew that soot and smoke east. So the preferable, cleaner place to live was west of industry, west of the mines, upwind. The west side became the fashionable part of town. We see this in Butte and Helena. Those 19th century mansions and finer homes were on the west side. The east side was the humbler side, the rougher side. But my relatives didn't live there. They lived east of the east side. So what do you get from my books? What you get, especially from all 3 books, is you do get the sweep of Montana history. One Night in a Bad Inn begins with the homesteaders, ends up with the miners. In that case, it's a miner working for the Anaconda Company. And then in East of the East Side, you get the, in both books, the immigrant experience coming to Montana. But it's the Joe Lozar here who was afflicted with an ailment you're all familiar with, I'm sure. It's called gold fever. It's the obsessive prospector. Some of those prospectors become Marcus Daly. Most we haven't heard of because they went broke. And I guess you probably know which category Joe Lozar falls into. So just briefly as to what the book is about, we have 4 central characters. This first one is Tony Lescavar. And Tony grows up on a peasant farm in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the area that is now Slovenia. So this is a Slovenian part of Austria. But he is not destined to live his life on the farm. He falls in love with music at a very young age. And he goes off to the big city to study music. I thought, in my 21st century thinking, his family probably paid for him to go. No, that's not how it worked. He just went off on his own, got a job, studied at the conservatory in Ljubljana, and musicians in Austria at that time were like the movie stars of today. They were idolized. When an opera singer died in Vienna, the flags were lowered to half-mast. I mean, music was just huge in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Tony was a big part of it. But even a bigger place was Paris. And in 1914, he is performing with the opera in Paris. So he has arrived professionally. He loves Paris. He's living the good life. And then we all know what happened at the end of June. The Archduke is shot. By August, everybody goes to war. So Tony is essentially behind enemy lines. He is Paris, but he is an Austrian citizen. And even if he wanted to, he couldn't get home. Now, we all know that the First World War dragged on for 4 years, but nobody knew that was going to happen. Well, some people did think at the time it was going to drag on, but a lot of people didn't. Other wars, 6 weeks, Austro-Prussian, the Franco-Prussian War was about 6 or 7 weeks, and it had been a long time since there had been a major war in Europe. So Tony kind of passed himself off as Serbian as long as he could, but as you can imagine, Paris, all of France, is being emptied of men of military age, and he's 28 years old. So he ends up in East Helena, Montana, and so... And how he gets there, of course, is a big subject of the book. One thing I will add, though, about this book, I could have written a much shorter book if I just wrote the story of my family, but those aren't the kind of books I wanted to write. Same thing with One Night in the Bad Inn. I wanted you to get to know the people, the time. I wanted you to be immersed in their lives. And to do that, you need historical context, and you need to know about the places they lived in, what life was like then. So what you also get in my books is a culture and a cultural history and a history lesson. A professor from Washington State University said, my books are like getting peanut butter, medicine in your peanut butter. You're getting a lesson, but you don't know it because you're enjoying it. So anyway, then we move on. So that's briefly the story of Tony Leskovar, who's my grandfather. So when he ends up in East Helena, he meets the Lozars. These are Joe and Caroline Lozar. Anybody here from the Helena area? Are familiar with Helena? Okay, when you drive from Helena to East Helena, there used to be a 2-story stone building right on you could see it from the highway. It wasn't on the highway. That they called it the Old Rock Hut. Well, that was the saloon that Joe Lozar built. And so Tony befriends the Lozars. They're countrymen. They're also from Slovenia. They're immigrants. And he delivers groceries. Joe had a saloon and mercantile in East Helena. And Tony delivered the groceries as a side job. He actually was in East Helena to be the band leader for the Smelter Band. And so he meets the boss's daughter, Annie. And I love there's a part in the book that I just love. So she hears that this Austrian musician is coming to East Helena. And I imagine she's 22 years old. She thinks he's going to be tall and handsome and debonair. And he was. He was all those things. And as her sister said, as soon as Annie saw him, she set her cap for him. And Tony was a goner at that point. This was like Cary Grant marries Molly Brown. They had a very volatile marriage. I don't remember my grandparents ever really saying a civil word to each other. I mean, it's kind of humorous, but the benefit of that was that my father, he said if that was marriage, he was never going to get married. He would stay single. And my parents had a very happy marriage, so they were people who saw what not to do. And so anyway, just to kind of jump back then to Joe and Caroline. So Caroline actually came from Vienna. She's Slovenian. She was the offspring of the Baron and the Maid. So it's sort of Downton Abbey-esque, but real people, and in Austria. And this was in Novo Mesto, which is kind of what is the southern part of present-day Slovenia. And then her mother, so she didn't know her father. At that time in Austria, if the child was born out of wedlock and the father would not attest to paternity, legally, officially, there was no father. The child had no father. But as I heard from other families also, often the father would furtively support the child. So her mother died very young, and then she's sent to Vienna to work in service. Any of you who saw Downton Abbey, she's sort of like Daisy. Remember, there's a scene where Daisy says, "I got no family." So that was Caroline. Well, the thing is, she was a kitchen maid. Then she became the cook. And, you know, for a girl in her circumstances, this gave her great opportunity because it was not the Parisian cooks that were most sought after. It was the Viennese cooks in the 19th century. And so then she comes into some money. And I kind of think it must have been her father's dowry. Now, again, in my books are nonfiction, so unless I know it, I don't say it happened, but sometimes I'll tell you my opinion, like maybe, or else I kind of hint at what I think happened, but I try to be very clear what I know and what I don't know. So she comes to Calumet, Michigan, where there were copper mines there, and there were a lot of Slovenians there. And then she hears about this new town where they needed a cook, and this was East Helena. Before, when East Helena wasn't even a wide spot in the road, there was no town there. It was just they built the smelter, and then there was a big boarding house for the workers, and then also like a dining room for the management. And I'm not sure which one, but she worked at one of those. And then Joe met her in Calumet, this pretty young thing. He follows her, and they got married in the cathedral in Helena. So, but in my family, all roads lead to Butte, so they will eventually all end up in East Butte. So we want to have some time for discussion. So I will end my part there, but I want to get to the subject for this session, which was about the things we don't talk about. So I was really flummoxed by this. I kept thinking about the things we don't talk about. Why can't I think of the things we don't talk about? And then I realized why. It's because I'm from Butte, and we talk about everything when you're from Butte. But you know, and this was a real surprise to me. Several years ago, I think, Craig, you were there at the High Plains Book Festival. And this came up in one, I don't know if you were there, one of the sessions about the people like on the ranches in eastern Montana, that they won't talk about the stories and all. And this was a revelation to me that, that there were people, that there are things that they don't talk about. So it really depends on your background and where you're from. So so I'm really, you know, I have to kind of pitch this over to Michael now because we talked about everything, so still do. So actually, Michael, I do have a question for you, and I might have just missed it. You probably addressed it. You were saying that there was a letter that Rose wrote where she said that she was treated like anybody else in White Sulphur Springs, but then something changed. Was that in the 1950s? Was that later? What was it? I was trying to think of what the time frame was there.
So,
Oh, yeah, come up here. Yes, sorry.
so there's she makes a very clear distinction in her writing between when she was growing up and another period that she doesn't necessarily specify, but I do think that things that she found things more vexing through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? I think there was a sawmill that was operating around White Sulphur Springs that brought up a lot of Southern workers. She had to, and those were some of her patients from the hospital because they got injured at the sawmill, right? And I think that's something that she had commented on in letters, that she had some problems with some of the new arrivals. But there are other things too. I mean, when she decided to run for mayor, she got an anonymous letter from someone saying that if you should withdraw from this race because even if you win, no one on the council is going to serve with you, and that Miss Gordon is because you are black, right? So it certainly it becomes more. Yeah, it was 1951, right? It certainly becomes. It seems like it becomes more visible during that period. Yeah.
We can open it up for questions also. If there's any questions anybody has for any of us? Yes.
I probably missed it, but what was the reason? Thank you. What was the reason that they came to Montana? You said 1880 is when they came. What was the reason?
Well, of migration to Montana in general, and especially for emancipated slaves in Kentucky and Missouri. You get on the river, you get on the steamboat going north, and it takes you up into Montana. That's part of it, is because there was just a path from the south to anywhere else that was readily available there. So that was a big part of it. There was also the draw of mining at that time, and also the various military installations in Montana, the various forts housed black troops. So I would think as well that some of the population came from people who either traveled with soldiers, right, or soldiers themselves who, after mustering out, may have stuck around.
Oh, as to why they came? Okay, with Tony Lescavar. Okay, so he's a musician. So he fled the First World War, got here in 1915. Actually, while he was at sea, the Lusitania was sunk at that same time. So back then there were silent movies, which really they just weren't silent because of talking, but they had music. And an orchestra traveled, the films traveled in cans on the train from place to place, and an orchestra went with the movie. Now, they would supplement with local musicians. So Tony, one of the gigs he got when he first arrived was he traveled with a silent movie, and that particular movie went broke in Helena. And so that's how he ended up in Helena. Yeah, I think in somewhere east, he was with his brother in Illinois. He did go to see his brother, and then he did do a little gig with the Chicago Symphony, and and so then he's in Helena, and then he hears that the smelter, and East Helena at that time was known as a Slovenian community. I mean, throughout the West, it was known as Slovenian, and he heard they needed a band leader and a music teacher for the smelter band. So, yeah, and with Joe and Caroline. It was the mines, that brought them to Calumet. But it's still kind of interesting. There were a lot of Slovenians in Cincinnati and in New York and other places. So it is, I just think it was kind of the immigrant internet back then, where they just heard from somebody. And again, it was mines, and then again, mines, the same thing. That, the smelter in East Helena.
I'm wondering, the panel is titled "Who We Don't Talk About," and I'm wondering, are these things that people weren't talking about, or are these things that white folks weren't talking about, or people who are Native weren't talking about, and what that difference is for y'all?
I guess some of it is in terms of what's been part of the story of the settling in the West, right, or the history of the West, that there's some stories that have not been talked about, right, such as the story of African Americans in Montana, right, and so that's part of it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's fortunately, the whole thing with racism, it's the other, right? And it's kind of tribal. But that also went on with the immigrants, too. But one thing that happened, so my relatives, this is First World War, and my great-grandparents have this saloon in East Helena, and they raised 5 daughters and 1 son. And so the kids are all born here in the U.S., but to a mother who didn't even speak English in 1900, but they did speak German, and they were from the place that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, the editor of the newspaper at that time in Helena, Will Campbell, came out so vehemently, berserk, anti-German. Mostly it was anti-German, not so much anti-Austrian, but they all kind of got looped together. And then we also had the Sedition Act that was passed in Montana that really, really went overboard. And some places it was worse than others. And Helena and Forsyth, the 2 places my relatives lived, were 2 where it was really bad. And I just kind of wonder, all of a sudden, my grandmother's sisters all left. And I kind of wondered if that was why, because one of them was working as a maid for a prominent family in Helena, and one of the things that Will Campbell wrote, and he's just trying to get people worked up. He actually printed this, and I talk about this in the book. He actually printed this picture. It's a painting, but it looks like a photograph of New York City being bombed. Now, we all know World War I, the Germans no one had even flown across the Atlantic. Lindbergh was later. So it was so berserk. I have done lots of research on World War I, but when I saw that picture, I was really startled. So I can't imagine what it was like for people in 1918 to see that picture. He was just really trying to whip up all this war fever. And, my grandmother's sisters were like 20 years old. They're single. Peer pressure is really tough at any time. And so I kind of think that might be why they left. So that might be one of the stories we don't talk about because they didn't want to remember a bad memory. One of them went to Great Falls. And she went to Butte for a while because Butte was different. As we know, my dad calls Butte an island surrounded by land. You didn't have these kind of issues in Butte and that you had in Helena as far as the anti-immigrant or the anti-German sentiment. And then one went to San Francisco. They all end up in San Francisco later. So it was. She felt more comfortable in Butte and Great Falls than in Helena.
Sort of going back to your question too, I think with Rose Gordon, one of the things that she both talked about and didn't talk about was race, right? It was part of her experience of the West, but she was very careful in her writing about her experience in the West that was something that she only occasionally talked about and was very careful about the ways that she spoke about racial experience. So I think for Rose in particular, some of what doesn't get talked about by Rose is that sort of experience, right? Although she does so in ways that are more suggestive and elusive than direct.
I have a quick question. I was just thinking about the Basque sheep herders. Were they in Wyoming? Were they in Montana too?
I know they were in Nevada.
So they brought their own culinary culture.
Yeah.
Did any of your relatives bring a culinary culture to Montana? And if so, does it still exist?
Oh, I'm from Butte. Can I speak to that? Sure. Oh, yes. Please come and bring your recipes. Absolutely. Yes, definitely. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Butte Heritage Cookbook, but that's a wonderful cookbook that goes through the different ethnic groups in Butte at the time with a little description. It's actually one of my favorite cookbooks. The recipes are great. So, yes, I still make pizza the way my great-grandmother taught my grandmother to make it. My grandmother taught me. And my other grandmother taught me to make pasties. I think those of us who grew up in Butte, we definitely had that culinary richness. My mom used to make stuffed cabbage leaves. I didn't know that was sarma. I didn't know it was Serbian. It's actually from, a variation on that from many different Eastern European countries. So we were in a culinary melting pot, but it just seemed normal. Like, it seems so funny to me that in Butte you have Italian tamales. But it seemed normal, Trozzolino's tamales.
So Rose Gordon's father, James Francis, went to, I'm going to lose the name of the school. He went to college in Ohio, at a black college in Ohio, and got a degree in culinary arts. And so he was a cook and a chef. And he came to Montana to cook at the mining camps. But he was also the first chef at the Higgins House Hotel in White Sulphur Springs. And the menus for that restaurant were occasionally published in the newspaper. And so what he was cooking in White Sulphur Springs was French cuisine, right? Was what he was doing, right? And then the Gordon restaurant, Rose, it seems, specialized, particularly in doing chicken dinners and turkey dinners, were the things that she advertised in the newspapers most often.
Just to comment on the food. I think it's quite ironic that Butte has one of the most famous Chinese restaurants in the world. And I spent some time studying Butte Butte's history, and I greatly respect the people from there, man. They've been through some stuff, and it's most interesting, and I think your book would really add to my interest.
Okay.
Michael, you talked about a Black community that had come to Montana and to White Sulphur Springs when Rosamond Taylor's family came here. Do you have any sense of, did the other families from that community stay in the area, or was it just Rosamond Taylor's family?
There was a substantial Black community, right? So one person, and in part, the White Sulphur newspapers were unusual for Western newspapers in that they reported pretty regularly on African American citizens. So there are a lot of stories of those folks in the newspapers. One person that kind of stood out was Irving Smith, who was a blacksmith and who owned his own blacksmith shop, and he did that from the early 1880s until his, shortly before his death at the turn of the century. So there were. I don't think that there were necessarily as many families in White Sulphur Springs, Black families. So there weren't as many Black children going to the schools, for example. When you see photographs of the Gordon children at school, it's usually they're the single Black person in their class. But there were other people who were there and were working, including James Joseph Meeks, who had served in the Civil War in one of the Black troops, right? I can't remember the number, but the troop that the movie Glory was made about, right? So he was in that and served in the Civil War in that. But he was known as being like a very canny finder of mines and locator of mines, right? And had a pretty nice house in White Sulphur Springs and lived there all his life with his wife Sarah. So there definitely was a community there. You see them beginning to move out at the turn of the century, and that just seems to be in general what's happening in Montana. The Gordons stayed, right? They found contentment in the city there.
I just wanted to add your comment about Butte, being interested in Butte. Between One Night in a Bad Inn and East of the East Side, you really get the entirety of Butte history up and from the beginning until about 1970.
Fascinating stuff I've read about it.
Yeah.
And we went out there a couple of weeks ago and just toured all, where the mine disaster was and where the explosion was. I mean, it's amazing that those people stood what they have.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, we're basically at the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I encourage you to check the schedule and take in as much of the festival as you can. And I also encourage you all to support your authors. And there's a very intentional effort to make the book festival as affordable as possible, and that's done for its own sake, but also with the hopes that folks will buy some books. So there's a fact and fiction table just right down there at the end, and I know that the authors will be hanging out, doing signings. Buy some copies. They make great gifts. And yeah, thank you. So buy 2, buy 3. But yeah, thank you all for coming out.